discovering truth, and your willingness to be fair when we study the history of the church.
Yeah.
And that impressed me. I have been to studies before that were singularly focused, and it wasn't inclusive. But I was impressed with your goal for the study.
Yeah. And thank you for sharing that, Mike. That's going to be really important in what we discussed tonight, because the first half of the talk, we're going to be talking about the church and not so great a light. We're going to be realistic about church history and things that have happened throughout church history. So that's a great thing to point out. Anyone else before we get started?
There are many things I enjoyed about your talk, but something that stuck out with me from the beginning was the idea that you said when you made your conversion, hearing people say, well, this is what I grew up with and this is why I believe what I believe is because that's what my parents believe in.
Right.
It's not a very strong argument.
Right.
So if we're going to evangelize and we're going to help others that are trying to come into the church, we have to know our history.
Yeah.
It's not about arguing.
Exactly. And it would be unfair for us as Catholics to have a standard for our Protestant brothers and sisters that we don't have for ourselves. So just to look at their beliefs and say, well, you just believe that because that's what you were born and raised in. They could just finger wag right back at you, So if you don't know why you believe what you believe, then it's kind of a hypocritical stance to take. So that's a good point. So session one, main takeaways, like those were two great ones, but the whole idea was to just kind of lay the foundation for how we should approach this topic. Justin and I were just talking before this, the old saying, you don't talk religion, politics, money, that sort of thing. Marcus and I have said this before, I never really agreed with that because those are three of the most important things in our lives. So, but you have to be in the right mindset and you have to approach it the right way to make sure people aren't getting upset. So that's the goal. So tonight I'm really excited because we're actually going to get into some tangible information and not just talk attitudes and philosophies and stuff like that. So tonight's session is on the Protestant Reformation. And so one of the things that I got some feedback last week was it would be nice for you guys to have something to look at. I know this may not be the easiest thing to follow. It's not the prettiest thing, but this is my outline for the class, so I thought it might be helpful. But as always, if you guys have any recommendations or suggestions moving forward, I'm all ears. I want to do everything we can for this to be as helpful as possible. So, session two. What are some things that we're going to talk about tonight? So we're going to try to understand the historical context of the Reformation. It's really important when talking about the Reformation to understand a little bit of historical context. So we're going to get into that. We're going to discuss key figures and events that shaped the Reformation. We're going to talk about the impact of the Reformation on the Christian landscape leading up to today, and then connecting the historical roots. So just like session one, I've tried to anticipate a few questions that someone may have. So the first question is, what's the purpose of this class? So my main goal for this class is for everyone to walk away and not be an expert on the Reformation. That's not possible. So there's hundreds of thousands of books. There are men who are PhDs in just one singular bullet point on this outline. They've done their doctoral studies. So it's not going to be possible for us all to be experts on this, but the goal is just to have a general idea of what the Reformation was. To be able to go away from this class and just have an understanding, a summary of it, so to speak. So that's the goal. Why is it important to know about the Reformation? I think it's really important, especially like we talked about in the first class when we're talking to our Protestant brothers and sisters. It's important to know where they're coming from, because if we don't know where they're coming from, then it's really hard to have discourse and dialogue. So it's important. And then I put on here, so I think I've shared this last class maybe, but one of my theological sparring partners, John, when I was discerning coming into the church, we were meeting about once a week. And we got to a point where he felt exasperated, I think, because he didn't quite have answers for, we kind of got down to the nitty gritty. And one of the meetings, one of the last ones we had, he finally got to the point where he just put his stuff down on the table. He was like, Shane, the Reformation happened for a reason. You know, and he's right. The Reformation did happen for a reason. And it's important to understand why it happened. And so that's one of the reasons why it's important for us to look at this. So we already discussed what we'll be talking about. I put another snapshot there. So does anyone have any questions or comments before we get into the historical context? And like I shared in our first class, at the end of all my main bullet points, I'm going to kind of pause. And that's a perfect opportunity for someone to ask questions or comments. Feel free to interrupt me when I'm speaking. I definitely, like I said, first session, I want this to be an open discourse and dialogue. I don't want to just be up here talking for 45 minutes. So feel free to interject. So anything before we get started? Okay. So the historical context of the Reformation. We're going to look at the state of the church before the Reformation. And the state of the church, just to lay a general snapshot of the church. So Jesus teaches the apostles, disciples the apostles, and gives them the Great Commission. What's the Great Commission? Yep. Yep, to the ends of the earth. And so in the book of Acts, that's exactly what we see. We see the apostles going to the ends of earth. And baptizing, making Christians, but also establishing churches. And that's where a lot of the letters after, the book of Acts, they're churches, they're pastoral letters to all the churches. So Jesus, the apostles, after Jesus' ascension, that's when you see the churches start to be formed, especially after the 4th century, because the first 300 years of church history, Christians were being killed. So it was pretty underground. So around the 4th century, leading up to the 16th century when the Reformation was, you see the church doing just that and having great success in spreading and evangelizing, but also in establishing new churches. And so if you can imagine 1,500 years of Christendom, so to speak, by the time of the Reformation in the 16th century, the church was a powerhouse. I mean, it had spread all across the world, and it enjoyed a lot of fruit from that success. And so I have on here the dominance of the church in medieval Europe. I don't think it can be understated how prominent the church was in the lives of someone who lived in the late medieval era. It wasn't like it is today. It's kind of hard for us to imagine, but the church was foundational to the community, to the individual, and it was singular in that if you were a Christian, you went to the same church. You believed pretty much the same things. It was way more united. So, just like today, the church takes donations, it takes tithes. When people pass away, in our lives, we're blessed by the church, and we attend St. Mary's, and we reap a lot of the blessings from the church. So we have a lot of fondness for the church. People pass away, they leave wills, they leave an inheritance to the church. So you can imagine after 1,500 years, the church had become quite wealthy. And so there's a lot of Protestants who will look at that and act as if that's a negative, a negative thing. But in my opinion, that's a really strong argument and a strong witness to the church because it had been so successful in evangelizing. It had a profound effect in the lives of the late medieval people. And I have a quote here from, in my opinion, one of the best books written by a Protestant on the Reformation. And I'm not going to try to pronounce this guy's name. McCulloch is his last name. But he has a quote in there where he says, "The church was not as corrupt and ineffective as Protestants have tended to portray it. It genuinely satisfied the spiritual needs of late medieval people." And I think that's important to understand that as to how the church rose to its prominence and became this powerhouse in medieval Europe. So that's important to keep in mind. So kind of shelf that. It's important to understand where the church was at. So with any time something is blessed and has success, you always see bad actors come in. And it tends to attract the worst. It's kind of like we talk about politics. They say it attracts the worst of people. And so you see the church have this great success monetarily, so to speak. And so you start to see a lot of corruption in the church, a lot of clerical corruption. And two of the things that were happening in the church, one was what's called simony, which is buying and selling ecclesial offices. So when you have a parish that's extremely wealthy, and let's say you have an elderly bishop, he had a nephew who was 8 or 9 years old, he may have sold that office, to guarantee that position, because it was a wealthy endeavor, so to speak. And you also see this with some of the papal offices, with the Medicis in the late 15th and 16th century. So that's called simony, and it's named after Simon Magus, who is described in the Acts as the guy who was offering the apostles to grant him the Holy Spirit. He was trying to bribe them. Hey, I'll pay you whatever you want, just give me the power that you have. So that's where that term comes from. And then the other main issue with the church at this time was the abuse and misuse of indulgences. And I put abuse and misuse there for a reason. A lot of times when you talk to Protestants, they'll say, well, one of Martin Luther's main concerns was indulgences. It wasn't necessarily true that his main concern was indulgences. It was the abuse and misuse of indulgences. So a modern day example would be if a 16-year-old kid goes out and is drag racing down the street, we wouldn't say, well, we need to take away all cars. We would say, no, that kid needs to learn how to use the car properly and its proper use. So I put abuse and misuse there purposefully. And we'll cover indulgences, I believe, in session 5 when we talk about the sacraments. We won't get into that too much tonight, but just keep that in mind. So simony and the abuse and misuse of indulgences. Those were the two of the main issues in the church going on. And then I put, for the last point there, the church in many ways was a victim of its success. And I heard Dr. John Bergsma put it that way one time, and I thought that was a good way to put it. So that's kind of the state of the church. And like Mike said, I'm trying to be fair and paint a realistic picture here. So the next point is the cultural and social climate. And this is extremely important to understand as well. So in the late medieval period, you see a lot of economic changes. So has anyone ever heard of feudalism? What's feudalism?
You own land and you have people that come and work for you almost as indentured slaves.
Yeah, exactly. So feudalism, you have your king, and then he has, lords and nobles who he grants land to. Those lords and nobles will then allow, peasants to work the land and make a profit. And some of that profit goes back to the lord and noble, and then some of it goes back to the king. So feudalism was very prominent in the medieval era. But towards the end of the medieval era, you see the fall of feudalism and the rise of what's called the merchant class. So this is what we would know today as, entrepreneurs, so to speak. You had merchants who were trading, who were starting to develop their own crafts, woodworking, whatever it may be. This idea that the only way to make money for someone in the lower class system was just to work the fields, that was kind of fading out. So this is really important because you start to see a huge system shift going from feudalism to the rise of that merchant class. So keep that in mind. The other thing that was going on at this time was the Renaissance. We've all heard of the Renaissance, and one of the main philosophies of the Renaissance was what's called humanism. And I have a definition here, but just when you're thinking of humanism, think that it's a shift in a mindset from thinking about God and what God wills to the individual and to what human beings will. So there was very much this idea that man is empowered to take control of his own destiny, whether it be through classical education, whatever it may be. So there was this shift going on in humanism. And humanism was important because, like we're going to cover with a lot of the early reformers, almost all of them, one thing they have in common, almost all of them were formally trained in humanism when they went and were educated. So that's something to keep in mind.
What is yes that?
Yeah. Does that remind you of anything that's going on today, in colleges? So keep that in mind. Another important thing is the invention of the printing press with Johannes Gutenberg in 1440. So the reason why this was so important to the Reformation is because up until this point, if you had information or if you had data, you would have to handwrite it. Imagine before this class, if I had to go through and handwrite 20 copies, of this outline, it would have taken me a long time. Instead, thankfully, Kim was able to print it out. So thank you, Kim. But it was much quicker. So with the invention of the printing press, we see books are able to be produced at a much more efficient rate. So they're cheaper, it's easier to spread ideas. This is another thing that's really important. And then the final thing that I put in here is the rise of nationalism. So not to get too deep into this, but this understanding that as Americans, we identify as Americans, right? We're from the United States. To a late medieval person, this understanding of, oh, I'm a German or I'm French, this would have been a foreign idea. Their identity was mostly tied up in what we were talking about with feudalism, their local community and their lord and maybe their monarchy. So you see this rise of nationalism where nation states started to form and develop their own identities. And this is important. So 4 things just to review. You see the decline of feudalism. You see the rise of the Renaissance with humanism and humanistic ideas. You see the invention of the printing press and the rise of nationalism. So Marcus and I were just talking about this the other day, but when you look at the Reformation, it truly was the perfect storm. There were so many things going on in this time that just made a hotbed for the Reformation to occur. And in my opinion, these 4 are 4 of the biggest things. So any comments or questions about any of that?
Did you see anything about the bubonic plague right before it as well? And a lot of priests were killed off. And so then that was kind of I've only seen it a few different times. I haven't read very much about it. But essentially, the church lost a lot of good priests because they were ministering to the sick, therefore dying.
Yeah.
And then left behind are the ones that were too afraid to go do that.
Yeah.
And now they're the ones also teaching.
Yeah. Do you know when the bubonic plague was? I don't know off the top of my head.
I thought it was in the 1400s.
That'd be interesting. That's a good point. That's a really good point. I'd be interested to know when that happened. Anyone else? I know that's a little boring, but we're gonna bring it full circle. We're gonna tie it back in, but I think it's important to touch on that.
Was Luther a humanist?
Yes.
Okay.
And we're gonna. He asked if Luther was educated in humanism, which he was.
Did he ascribe to it? It seems like the opposite of what. Because he was always. Never mind. That's not.
Yeah. Well, we're going to cover that when we go over key figures.
Mid-1300s.
Yeah.
Bubonic,
Yeah, it's at 14th
1300s.
century. Yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah, that's a good point, Justin. Anyone else? Okay. So early reform. So before the Protestant Reformation, you had a few other people who were calling for reforms inside the church. One of the main guys that a lot of Protestants will talk about is John Wycliffe, and he's referred to as the morning star of the Reformation by Protestants. They view Wycliffe as kind of the guy who paved the way for someone like Luther and Calvin to come in and do what they did. But John Wycliffe was a Catholic priest from 1330 to 1384. He was a Catholic priest, theologian, philosopher, educated in humanism, like all these guys we're going to talk about. And what's what's something to note about him is he's the first person to formally deny transubstantiation. So up until this point, you can't find a single person in writing who formally denied transubstantiation and the real presence in the Eucharist. Not a single one. And that's something that's important. There were a few people who expressed a disagreement about transubstantiation itself, but believed in the real presence. And we'll get into that in a little bit. But Wycliffe was the first person to formally deny transubstantiation. Do you have something you want to share, Marcus?
Just to be clear with terminology, formally deny the true presence, more so than transubstantiation, just because the difference between transubstantiation and consubstantiation.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. So that's John Wycliffe. And one of the next ones is John Huss, who also was a Catholic priest, theologian, philosopher. Something to note about him is he denied the Petrine offense, papal authority, sacred tradition as an element of the deposit of faith, and was kind of an early frontrunner of sola scriptura. So one thing to note is these guys were Catholic priests. They were all Catholic. That's something it's important to keep in mind. So those are two of the main early reformers that a lot of Protestants will look at. But I wanted to put in here, there were many people inside the church who were calling for reform. And many of them we know today as saints. And so I have listed on here St. Francis of Assisi in the 12th century, who was the founder of the Franciscans. He kind of saw some of the things going on in the church and was inspired to live a Christian life of poverty. And that's where the Franciscans are founded from. St. Dominic in the late 12th century, founder of the Dominicans. St. Catherine of Siena, who kind of let the Pope have it a little bit about some of the things he was doing. St. Ignatius of Loyola in the late 15th century, who was the founder of the Jesuits. So all these people were reformers inside the church. But what separates them from guys like John Wycliffe and John Huss? And this is really important. The difference between Wycliffe and Huss versus the Catholic reformers, who many of we know today as saints, is that they sought reform and renewal from within the church and not outside it. And if there's any point to take away from this class, it's this one right here. This is extremely important. Because just like we talked about in session 1, when you're having a theological debate with someone, you could be right in the wrong way. Remember how we said that? And when I think of that, that's what I think about guys like Huss and Wycliffe. You could be right about some of your concerns, but you could go about it the wrong way. So like I said, if there's anything to take away from this class, it's the difference between a lot of the saints we know today and a lot of the early Protestant reformers was they sought reform and renewal from within the church.
Yeah, but when they stood within the church, it means that they were humble.
Right.
Like Saint Ignatius, he was asked not to teach. He was considered as a heretic, and he had a lot of reasons to get out of the church. But he stood, waited, prayed, waited for his time till Pope or the authorities allowed him. So that humility, all of them had that humility. And all of these saints, they were in a way persecuted by the church. In a way, they were really struggling. But they had the patience to wait upon God.
Yeah.
So,
Yep.
And obedience,
Yeah.
humble and obedience.
it
They
is
were
obedience,
obedient.
that obedience was so great.
Yeah.
So even they know that they are right, but when the church authorities told them, you do this, they would just wait.
Right.
Like Padre Pio, he was told not to celebrate Mass publicly. He obeyed for years. He could have easily come out of the church and he had thousands of followers. But
Yeah.
he stayed in the church, just obeyed the Pope.
Yep. Yeah, those are really good points. So any other comments or questions before we move on to key figures of the Reformation? So key figures, you guys have all probably heard of Martin Luther. So Martin Luther was a Catholic monk, professor, and theologian from 1483 to 1546. And the main thing, and I'm sure most of you have heard of this, is Luther's 95 Theses. So Luther was a monk who really struggled internally with his sanctification. He really struggled with this idea that how could I possibly be made right in the eyes of God? He really struggled with this understanding of how am I made right in the eyes of God? He struggled with the sacraments. He struggled with he struggled with
That he could earn his way to heaven.
yes, exactly. But saying that, that's not the Catholic view. That's why I'm looking for the right words here. But just
That's how he tended to.
that's kind of how he viewed it. Yeah, exactly. So he struggled with that, and he saw a lot of the issues that were going on with the simony and the abuse of the indulgences. One of the main things that happened in Luther's life was he kind of had these grandiose ideas of the church, and especially of Rome. And he took a trip to Rome during this time and kind of, saw some of the nonsense that was going on with some of the guys there and some of the bishops. And it was kind of, like I said, he had these grand ideas and this grandeur about what the church was and these holy men. And then he goes to Rome and sees the reality of the situation. He sees, their fallen natures in a lot of regards. And it was really disillusioning for him. So he comes up with 95 Theses, which were criticisms of the church in its current state. A lot of times Protestants will say that all 95 are about indulgences, and they're not. There are many, many things that Luther had, took an issue with. And he takes these 95 Theses and he puts them up in Wittenberg. And a lot of people think Luther had this idea that he was going to go start his own church when he did this. And that's not at all what he had in mind. He was hoping to reform the church, from the inside, like we've talked about. So Martin Luther is really important because Luther's 95 Theses was kind of just caught fire and was a huge scandal at the time. And like we talked about, when you understand the historical and the cultural context of everything that was going on, Luther was friends with Johannes Gutenberg, so he had access to the printing press. So these 95 Theses and other writings that he were doing were able to be spread pretty easily. Any comments or questions